Please join me in welcoming Hank Schuring, Vice President and the Head of Rare Neurological Diseases at Santa Fe Genzyme, who's going to moderate this next amazing discussion. Hank?
Thank you. So, welcome everybody. Can you hear me upstairs? So, the session today, our panel will talk, and I'm very happy to have very distinguished members, by the way, so I can do the moderation. It will be about best practices in startups, and I just want to come back to what Dan just said. For me, it is fascinating working at Genzyme for now over 17 years to hear that some people never had spoken to a patient when already working for 8 years on a product. It is something that I really think, and I hope the panel will come back to that. So, Henk Schuring, pharmacist by training, 25 years in the industry, started in Genzyme in '99, and I started with Pompe disease. And that has been the red line. I made it up to regulatory affairs, to the head for EMEA and JPAC, and then decided it was time to change and move to the commercial side. And I'm now responsible for the rare neurology disease area. That includes Pompe disease, but a lot of other diseases where there is no treatment yet. And some of the panel members have ideas on that and work on that. Very happy with it. One of the major reasons and drives for me to do this panel and to work in Genzyme is that I'm passionate about ensuring that we do the right thing for patients. I continue to believe that if we do the right thing for a patient, it will pay off in the commercial side. So with that, can I ask my panel members to introduce themselves, tell a little bit about their companies and their drive and how they ended up in patient advocacy. Maybe start with Annie.
Okay. Hi everybody, my name is Annie Ganot. I'm the mother of 3 children, and 4 years ago, my son, who is now 6, was diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And we decided as a family, we didn't accept what the doctors told us. We didn't accept that there wasn't an option for my son, that there were no treatments. And probably a lot of you are quite familiar with Duchenne. It's been a bit of a hot topic lately. For any of you that don't know the disease, it is a genetic muscle wasting disease. Boys that are diagnosed typically between the ages of 3 and 5. They are typically in a wheelchair around their early teens, and death in their 20s, and there is nothing we can really do. My husband and I decided to pick up our family. We were living in London at the time, and to move to Boston to start a drug development company solely dedicated to developing treatments and therapies for Duchenne. And what better place to be than Massachusetts? So we moved to the Boston area, and we now have a company in Kendall Square called Solid Biosciences. Solid is actually the translation of my son's name, which is Eitani, from Hebrew to English. And we are very excited. We've built a really big team. My husband is the CEO. I run patient advocacy. I do advocacy with my best friend and my partner, Carrie, who's actually in the audience and spoke earlier today, who has a 14-year-old son with Duchenne, and she runs our advocacy efforts in Europe. And we're very excited. We're in the R&D phase. This is about startup companies, so we are R&D. We are planning, and we're on track to have a gene therapy treatment in clinical trials next year, along with multiple other therapies for this disease coming into our pipeline. As a company, we take a 360 approach to trying to solve Duchenne, tackling the root cause, and also looking at how we can help patients address all of the symptoms, and to make patients' lives better. So that's me.
Thank you, Annie. Alan, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Alan Gilstrap. I head up the patient advocacy function at a little startup biotech company here in Cambridge called Exia Therapeutics. We're a fully funded subsidiary of Ionis Pharmaceuticals. And Axia is the Greek word for something that's precious and rare, something you keep close to you. Our CEO, Paulos Soteropoulos, is Greek, hence the Greek name. Formerly, I was at Genzyme, and I'm happy that my mentor is here in the room today, the person I learned so much about patient advocacy from, and Jamie Ring. I have to give her a little call out. But But I'm happy to be here today. And if I look back at my journey and really where I think I learned the nuances of patient advocacy was really walking through my wife's thyroid cancer diagnosis and treatment with her. I think that's really what formulated the rest of my journey. And in over 20 years in pharma in multiple roles, I can tell you that I'm in the best job of my life right now.
Kathy, can you?
My name is Kathy Gran. I'm Vice President of Patient Advocacy with Snow Companies. I've been to all of the patient summits from the beginning on the steering committee, and I will say they became better and better. And today has been so impactful hearing these stories, very emotional, and kind of brings everything full circle. A little bit about my background. I'm a nurse. I spent my clinical years working in oncology. My last few clinical years was in hospice. And then I went to industry, and I got into sales and marketing. And at one point, I actually was running a sales organization and was successful and having a great time with things. And then I got the diagnosis of colorectal cancer, which surprised me quite a bit. And it's funny, when Michelle was talking earlier today about the cauliflower, I forgot about the cauliflower because I remember my surgeon drawing a picture of my cancer and it looked like a cauliflower. So now I'm thinking that I wonder if oncologist is a special forceps. How do you describe the cancer so it looks like a vegetable? Maybe a vegetable that you're okay not liking the rest of your life. So now, thank you for got that permanently encrypted on my brain. But anyway, and when I got diagnosed with colorectal cancer, I was late stage 3B, and it was actually rectal cancer, to be quite honest. But I know we're all patient advocates and talk about uncomfortable cancer to have. It's funny because I would tell people I have rectal cancer, and they'd be like, "Wait a minute, I think it's gonna rain. I gotta go." And so then I switched it to colorectal cancer because that's too much. But my friends, I had a very close-knit group of friends that were extremely supportive during my whole journey, and they were like, "Oh, we're gonna start wearing brown ribbons now. We're gonna get to the bottom of this. Baby the asses." We had chemo kickoff parties and radiation wrap-up parties. It's quite the experience. But during that year-long treatment, surgeries and radiation, chemo, I did a lot of soul searching and decided that as much as I love the sales and marketing, what I really wanted to do was to be able to work with patients and be able to use my nursing background, my communication skills, and my own personal journey with cancer to help patients. So I went to Medzilla, which is themonster.com for the medical profession, for patients, and then patient advocacy. And then sure enough, right in my backyard was this opportunity with Millennium, which is now the data oncology company. So I walked in there extremely confident that I was going to get the job. I thought, how could they not hire me? Fortunately, I got the job. Once I started working on it, I'm like, wait a minute, I'm lucky to have this job. So I spent about 8 years working there, and some of my colleagues sitting here today. And then I actually, early on, working at Takeda, came across a company called Snow Companies. And my job initially was to do local patient outreach along with working with national organizations. And Snow was able to do that, and I started working with them for all 8 years. And then I was lucky enough that Brenda Snow offered me this job back in February, which allowed me to relocate, and here I am today.
So thank you all, and you hear that there is a very strong personal drive in all these people in patient advocacy. So maybe one of my first questions to our panel members would be, at what stage of the company life cycle was patient advocacy initiated? How early? Ellen, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start. Paula Soteropoulos, if she were here, she would say that the patient advocacy role was really the third role that she thought of when she was planning her new organization. So patient advocacy is just woven into the initial fabric of Exia.
I work
Kathy.
with a lot of different companies in my role at Snow, anywhere from emerging life science companies to small companies and large companies. And it really varies, as far as how early on. But I'm seeing more and more emerging life science companies. It's one of the first positions that they are hiring. And I truly believe that in order to be really focused on the patient, we've heard it several times today, it really needs to come from the top down within the organization. So that if you really want the patient voice to be heard throughout all the different functions, that it has to be the senior management that's walking the walk and talking the talk. One thing that I've been doing lately is working with some of these smaller emerging companies to help the scientists who spent most of their career behind the bench really understand what the patient journey is all about and what the patient experiences. And that's been really helpful because for them, they've been working on a molecule. They don't get to see all the time the other side and what the difference this means as far as a possible cure for a patient. We've also been working with the manufacturers that are making the drug and that these employees who work day to day on these assembly lines filling the vials or having something that might seem very mundane, going out and talking to them, bringing a patient speaker and having them realize how valuable their job is and that they are in fact saving lives as well. So I think that the sooner you can get involved, the better.
Annie, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure.
Because
I mean,
think-
our company is what it is simply because of my son, and that was the catalyst, And I think when we got into the space, it was about our son, and now I feel like I am the mother of 300,000 sons. And so, as a company and how we operate, we don't have to think about how do we incorporate the patient. It's natural because that's my community. The patient community is also my community. I wear multiple hats. I am a mother, and I also run advocacy for our company. But certainly in terms of incorporating patient voice, patient perspective, patient views from the earliest stage throughout everything we're doing has been critical to our process. And it's been something that just has been very natural for us as a company. So just in terms of some examples, everybody in the company knows my son. We have multiple mothers and their boys that come to our company. We talk about this disease. We talk about the real life living with Duchenne and what that means for patients. It helps guide the focus and the motivation of all of our staff in terms of research and development through to clinical, and how do we even think about designing trials and making sure, does this work for a patient? Can they do this? Is this something that is not going to cause too much of a burden on families? And just being very careful in making sure that we help provide that insight, because we can only be better by incorporating the patients from the very beginning.
Thank you for that. Just to go on that topic, and we will go back to the involvement in design of studies and the patient voice in the further. But I want to continue a little bit on this part. I want to understand in your companies, what is your reporting lines? How is patient advocacy organized? Is it reporting to the CEO? Is it part of medical? Is it part of commercial? Is it part of external affairs? And maybe expand a little bit on why choices were made for certain reporting lines. You want to start, Annie?
I report to the office of the president of our company. I can't report to the CEO, that's my husband, that's a little bit weird.
That would be a conflict.
It is a little bit weird. So I report to the office of the president. But more importantly, it has to be that patient advocacy interacts with every function of the company. So as much as that is our reporting line, and this is the individual in the office that has oversight for my function and a few other functions of the company, the most critical aspect is that we penetrate and liaise with everybody in the company, and everybody gets the patient perspective.
I would agree with that. In a company with only 26 employees, I feel like I have a lot of bosses, but I report into the VP of Commercial.
Thank you. Kathy, anything to add from your perspective?
Well, I also agree. I work with a lot of patient advocacy leads in many companies, and I see various reporting structures. I see PA leads report to Med Affairs, Government Affairs, Corporate Communications, Commercial, and in my role in patient advocacy prior to SNOW, we reported up to Corporate Communications. And I will say, I mean, it can all work depending upon the philosophy and the culture of the company. But I would say that I thought Corporate Communications did work well just because there was so much visibility internally and externally of our function. We got a lot of attention from senior management, worked very closely with my colleague Paul Kidwell in PR, who spotlighted so many stories and so many of the good things that we were doing as a pharmaceutical company that the public needs to be aware of. And we also, under the umbrella of corporate communications, was also internal communications. So we were able to do a lot of patient-centered activities with the support of internal communications and had the employees very engaged in doing fundraising activities and participating in big events like a Light the Night for the LLS. So in my experience, I thought that was a very good reporting structure, but I think, again, as both panelists said, it's really the philosophy and the culture of the company.
So what you're hearing from the panelists, if I summarize it a little bit, is that they start with patient advocacy very early. But what I think is the best message that you hear, it should be in your genes and in everything you do on a daily basis. It is not a marketing story, it's in your genes and you live it on a daily basis and you work with it in that way. So I would assume that most of the panel members probably have pictures of patients at work and have at least on a regular basis patients visiting, and I see them all nodding. That, I think, is one of the most important messages in these often rare diseases, because we don't know the disease, and if I look to my own area of work, Pompe disease, on a daily basis we continue to learn about the disease. Yet it is for more than 10 years approved currently, the treatment. But still we don't know everything. Which is probably a nice transition into the area of how to involve patients in your development. How early do you start? What are the type of questions? And Alan is already smiling, so I think I'm going to give him the first approach. At what stage in the research and development did you start involving patients, and what were the first questions that led to the involvement?
I would love to say that it started right at the very beginning, but as a startup of another research organization, we came into the game very late. So we had 2 phase 3 trials already enrolling when we came into the game. So we quickly played catch up. So immediately we brought in patients to tell their story, to do advisory boards. And I always, like Kathy said, I always make sure that my new colleagues have access to these patients' stories as early in their tenure within Exia as possible, because I know it's from what they say, and from their stories, hearing those patient stories may be the first time they've ever heard a patient story in their pharma career. And so infusing them with the patient story, with the burdens of disease that these patients live with, changes their life and the way that they face their job every day. So as early on in the process as possible, as early on in a colleague's tenure as possible. And right now we're just trying to really understand the burden of disease, because the disease states that we're working in, there's just not a lot out there about the burden of disease in medical literature. So it's really up to us to change that, leveraging the patient voice and raising the patient voice is critical.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask Annie a similar question, and I realize that you're prior to starting the clinical trials, so maybe you can focus a little bit on also the disease burden, but also how you're involving patients in getting the right design of your upcoming trials.
For sure. I think a bit of an example. So it's traditional biotech company typically takes a technology and thinks about what diseases can I potentially apply that technology to? How could this possibly suit a particular disease area or indication? We decided to start with the problem. Our problem was Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And we then went out in terms of our R&D efforts to canvass the entire globe of what treatments could actually provide meaningful benefit to patients. And a good example in terms of involving patients early on was around our gene therapy efforts. So we actually had 3 charities that we were very good friends with prior to moving from London to Boston, who were extremely savvy, extremely well-versed, really understood the science. And they came to us with the idea, and we, of course, were also looking at many things as well, of how can we help you do gene therapy? And so very, very early on, even before we started our full efforts around rallying around gene therapy, how can we partner with these 3 charities in the UK? And we ended up they are now equity partners in our company. They are true partners, shareholders in our company. And they were involved from the very, very beginning stage in terms of the development around our gene therapy efforts. And also in terms of R&D, again, we are not in the clinic yet. So in terms of R&D, making sure that everything we are thinking about is something that can really benefit patients. We had a couple mothers in our office last week, and we were talking about, what are they giving their son, some of the literature out there. And actually there was something that one of the mothers brought up that one of our heads of R&D said, that's really interesting. I'm going to look into that. And we do. So I think it's just really critical that these families, they're smart, they're savvy, they understand what living with this disease is all about. So only with partnering them from the very beginning is only going to help everybody be successful.
So let me add a little bit of a story to that, and then let's go into a little bit more depth here. I remember a conversation with a physician, rare diseases, and we were doing a double-blind trial. And he said, after 2 months, I have a patient who knows he is on treatment. And I was looking at the physician. I said, how can he know? It's blinded. And the physician said back to me, well, he basically said, and in this study we were using forced vital capacity and 6-minute walk test as clinical endpoints. So we were wondering, is it there? No. The patient said to the physician, I know I'm on treatment. Why? I have never been able to comb my own hair, and now I can comb my hair.
Wow.
And what I realized at that moment is we can do all the kind of trials, we can have all the kinds of endpoints, whether they are validated or not. We would have never captured this unless we speak to the patient. So, as we all know, in the current world, getting a regulatory approval is one. Then you get a health technology assessment, you get pricing reimbursement discussions. So I wonder if we could move this a little bit to how are we working on patient-reported outcomes or endpoints in our studies that support the totality of getting patient access rather than a regulatory approval only.
One
Kathy.
thing that we've been doing is working with companies that are even just in phase 1 or preclinical to put together a patient leadership council. And we help companies identify those patients that have a lot of reach, influence, but that are also very knowledgeable and can really provide valuable input. And get this group together and be able to have them engage on an ongoing basis so they actually act, in fact, like a steering committee for the company. And they help with protocol design, they help with endpoints, but they also are able to help other functions within the company as well. Even we had them help put together a registry, and each one of these patients that have been identified has have their own strengths. So there might be somebody that's more of a media person that could be a spokesperson, or someone, we have one particular council, a physician who's a patient as well and has done a lot of speaking in front of ODAC. So having a patient, almost, as I said, steering committee involved early on, I think can really help the direction of the company.
Anything to add, Alan?
I will just say that coming in late, we had, like I said, a difficult time informing the initial studies, but what we are using the patient voice now is to further understand the burden of disease to inform the follow-up studies that will be used to help expand the label a bit to more areas of these patients' lives that they're challenged with. So
Maybe, Annie, I'm going to ask it a little bit more directed to the Duchenne. In Duchenne, often you see 6-minute walk test. How are you working with patients to have some other endpoints that will show the clinical meaningfulness?
So we're working to develop a patient advisory board, and that's one of the big elements that is a focus. I'm not a scientist. I'm not running our R&D effort. I'm not a clinician. I think where I add value is ensuring that we bring the patient perspective in terms of helping make everything as objective as humanly possible. So with respect to 6-minute walk test and other endpoints, I really can't comment at this stage. It's just something that we need to involve the patients from a very early stage.
So what I think you're hearing from all is that patients are involved early in looking at endpoints, protocol, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a primary endpoint. It can be a patient-reported outcome that is secondary or tertiary, but build your case. And one of the challenges in rare diseases is that often you have 1 or 2 trials, so you have to compromise what to test and how to test and build your case. You have to look at totality of data, so that includes this type of thinking. Moving on a little bit on this, we have been seeing that patient groups are currently more and more involved, get an increased share of voice, and I would love to understand from the panel members if they have been able to have meetings with authorities, with patients to help regulators understand the disease, because often companies are challenged in understanding the disease early, but the same is true for the other stakeholders. Ellen, do you want to kick this one off?
Sure. In my previous role at Genzyme, we did have that opportunity, and we're preparing patient groups now to go before the FDA. But one thing I've learned recently is that when industry takes a patient or a patient group to the FDA may slightly discount that patient story or that patient group's story because, quite frankly, industry brought them there. The other challenge that as industry we have is if we take a patient into the room, I've learned that the FDA may be less likely to be transparent with us as it relates to honest feedback on our clinical program. So the best practice that we're trying to initiate is having patient groups go on their own. And so working through organizations like Global Genes or others that can assist in helping these patients prepare, and these patient groups prepare to tell their story in the most appropriate way that's most impactful for the FDA and for other regulators globally.
Just a comment on that. I know the point was brought up earlier today, but asking the patient groups to get involved, I think, is important and it's a key. And the timing of when you get involved with these patient groups then becomes really important because I've heard the frustration from some patient groups when they say, we got a call a month before a regulatory meeting and they want us to find patients. And there had been no partnership or solid relationship prior to. And they felt taken advantage of. And even though they wanted the drug to get approved, it just wasn't a partnership type of approach. The other thing that we've been working with some companies on now is creating videos so that these videos can be used with the FDA and regulatory. And sometimes some of these stories are difficult to just put into words what the patients are actually experiencing. And if you can actually see the patient and their daily living and what struggles that they're faced with in a video, I mean, YouTube is the most effective way of getting messages across right now. We found that to be very, very valuable.
And maybe to add to that, Kathy, what I think we should not underestimate nowadays is the power of internet. Mm-hmm. One thing we say today here in Boston, within a few hours is worldwide known, and 20 years ago that was a totally different environment. So let's make sure that we all realize that and how to use that in a worldwide manner. Annie, do you want to add?
Just like to add that bringing patients to the regulators I don't know. I mean, I definitely see the side that you want it to be transparent and open and everything is very clear. On the flip side, again, wearing my mom hat, I can see how that's a real big advantage for the regulators to hear from the patients directly. So I don't have a view yet, and we're not quite there in terms of our phase of development. I certainly can say that the power of patients is significant, and there's 2 Duchenne moms in the audience here who are very much a part and were amazing advocates in terms of getting the first ever treatment approved for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So I believe that patients are extremely powerful, and clearly the tide is shifting, and it's fascinating.
Alan?
I'd like to just add one thing. I was sharing vision with one of the patient organizations about the need for them to go to the FDA and to share their burden of disease with the FDA. And one of the patients said, Alan, she stopped me in my tracks. She said, Alan, I'm smiling right now because I have been dreaming of this day. I've lived my entire life with this condition and without a treatment, and I've waited for my chance to talk to the FDA. So encouragement just to the rare disease patient advocates in the room, engage the patient community, help them tell their story because they so have been waiting for people to listen to them.
So just one more thought addition to this. Keep in mind that in other areas in the world, other regions, patients' voice has been already incorporated in many of the regulatory processes, and patients are just one of the stakeholders around the table. If you look at the European process, scientific advice, patients are there and they have a voice. So there's a lot to grow there and a lot to do. But it's an important topic. So, and you already mentioned Duchenne, and I think it's great that patients were so able to support the process. But if you read some of the feedback nowadays, there is also some potential criticism. And I'm getting the sign that we have 10 more minutes, so we need to get ready for the Q&A. Annie, you're the first one that I think I should ask this question. Is there some kind of guidance on how much is good, how much is too little? Is there guidance with regards to how to involve the patients and how strong the patient advocacy should be?
So look, we have our first approved treatment in this disease, and nobody can doubt the power of the patient community involved with this effort. So I don't know. I really don't know. I think that this is something that we really need to investigate and understand and do what is right for patients and what's right for science. It's important that the science is not dictated by patients, that the voice is incorporated, but I think that it's incredibly important to involve patients.
Alan?
Science has to be spot on, and the patient voice brings that science to life. It puts a face and it puts emotion around the science, so critically important, but it can't be there without the science. I mean, it can, but it's not going to be as effective.
Yeah, I completely agree. The only word of caution I would put out there is that you have to be, we've talked about transparency already, but when working with patients or patient groups, letting them know that you're listening to them, you want to incorporate as much as you possibly can. Obviously, you have business objectives as a company, but I mean, not to give them false expectations that everything that they ask you to do, you're going to be able to do and go forward with. But I think if you have the right dynamics between individual patients or patient groups, that can happen.
Thank you. So, as I want to give absolute time to everybody to ask questions to the panel, let me try to summarize and then move on to the questions, and then please feel free to ask. So, what I've heard a lot is that the patient voice is important and should be there. What we also heard is that it has to be in the genes of a company. It is something you live on a daily basis. And personally, I would say that for me, the key point, if you want to be patient-centric outside, you will have to think about how to be people-centric within your company. The two go hand in hand. You cannot be patient-centric without people-centricity in the company. So, food for thought. Who wants to ask the first question?
I hear you talking a lot about the science and the patient advocacy being separate. A lot of us parents have become citizen scientists. We have. I never knew that I could understand what I understand today about my children's disease on a molecular level. I've actually made a discovery between, my daughter has dual diagnoses. One of them extremely, extremely rare, and then one of them not so rare, a connective tissue disorder. And I was able to, through just studying it and listening to other patients, make a connection that is now being studied at the Manton Center. So I think that the science and the advocacy is not always separated. There's a lot of us that know our kids' disease on a molecular level because no one's looking for my children's disease. I'm going to find it. If no one's going to look for a treatment, then I'm going to study the disease and I'm going to find it. And it's not beyond us to have that capability.
I think you raise a great point. In these rare diseases, collaboration between the academic, the treaters, patients, industry, all those parties, and payers, all those parties together is of the greatest.
Well, it's hard when no one else is looking for you. Like you feel like compelled to take it into your own hands.
Yeah.
And, you know, as a mother, you'd do anything.
Anything.
Hi, I'm Michelle Avery from Summit Therapeutics, and I just kind of wanted to ask of you, how do you go about measuring success of a corporate advocacy program?
Yeah, that's a question that's asked a lot.
You're looking for a KPI?
Yeah.
I doubt there is one,
Yeah.
but I'll leave it to the panel members.
Well, we talked, many years, in my former role, we've talked about this every year, about how we were going to measure our impact and make sure that the people that were supporting us financially knew what an impact we'd make. And we look at different things such as number of patients that we reached. We did a lot of live programming. There was surveys that would go out. We also had a third party, could have been snow companies, trying not to do a commercial, but call me if you need me. Do a third-party survey with advocacy groups that was independent and to see how we were doing as an advocacy function, and also internally as well. But I don't think, unless I'm wrong, that there's a scientific formula that you can look up to measure it. I think you have to just come up with your own metrics and kind of benchmark yourself against those metrics.
Yeah, the only suggestion that I may have that might help, and I don't have a clue if it works, but given how the patient voice is so embedded, there's a huge feeling of a purpose-driven company, which you should be able in HR type of best places to work test to find back. So that could be a way to see how much is the patient voice really embedded in your company and how much do you have a purpose-driven company.
Hi, I work as a part-time CFO with emerging market companies. What guidance would you give in terms of resource allocation? In emerging market companies, financial resources are scarce, yet they do work on very critical areas in the healthcare industry. So what experiences do you have from your companies when you're preparing budgets and forecasts? How do you prioritize between the various activities that these companies have to do?
I just went through that process for 2017 and 2018, and I will tell you, I was sitting with my COO and my VP going through the budget that I put together, and when I was asked about the line item for support of one of the patient organizations here in the US and one in the UK, I was asked how I came up with that figure, and I gave my best, answer, and my COO said, I think you should double that. So that tells me that my senior leadership values the role. And I'll have to go back to you and say, if you're having to prove the role of patient advocacy, I would say that patient advocacy isn't quite there yet in your organization.
There's a lot of organizations that talk about being patient-centric, and I do think there's a lot of biotech and pharma communities that actually live that out and live it out in meaningful ways. But I do think that in a number of cases, there's some skepticism too as well as to what's the purpose behind some of the more internally driven events, whether it's having a patient come in. I think scientists and others want that, but I think that you just referenced, the purpose-driven organization. And while that certainly is true that purposeful organizations provide more engaging work and they make people feel more connected, I've also sensed a hesitancy from candidates coming into interview or even from employees sometimes on to, what's the drive. I think there's a fine balance in the driving rationale of we're doing this to ultimately create more meaning versus as a way to drive motivation and maybe not a nefarious, but in a different way. So how do you strike that right cultural balance of bringing in patients and doing it for very altruistic and meaningful ways, but also maybe not making individuals feel like you're doing that to drive something with a different purpose?
For us, it's simple. For our company, it's simple. Nobody questions our motivation in terms of my husband and myself. And we feel that we've actually built a culture that shares that motivation. And we have a sense of urgency that money can't buy. And everybody that works at our company feels this amazing and wonderful pressure to get it right and to focus on patients and to listen to patients and to listen, not just listen to patients and understand and take their views and make it their highest priority. So, it's refreshing. There's nothing contrived. Everybody is on our mission with us. And we're grateful for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and whenever we brought patients in to speak, whether it would be at a town hall session or even during our national sales meeting when I was in my former position, all the feedback that we got was that it was the best part of the meeting. And they felt that it really motivated them. And there was never any feedback that said they questioned our motivation. It was more, this is what gets me out of bed in the morning. This is why I do my job. I remember a particular patient saying, when it's time, this was for a sales organization, when you're thinking about that last call to be able to educate a doctor about your therapy, make that call. Think about my sons. Think about the benefit that they're going to receive if this doctor is now aware of a new therapy that could change the course and direction of their life. So I haven't had that feedback.
The only two words that come to my mind is authentic and transparent. As long as you operate with those two qualities and you hire those type of people within your organization, it just becomes it just is natural.
I think that is coming back to what we said in the beginning. It has to be in the genes, and it is everybody embeds it. And as long as it is transparent and authentic, I've never had that type of feedback.
Hi, my name is Susan Ward. I manage a collaboration between drug companies, clinical experts, and advocacy groups in Duchenne. And I wanted to come back to the question of science and regulators. And I think the Duchenne recent experience, I couldn't echo more how powerfully the advocates worked in the recent approval. But my observation was that, even though there are very many really smart citizen scientists, I like the term, and powerful patient advocates, there's a disconnect between, I think, a genuine desire on the part of the FDA to take heed of the patient voice, but they don't know how. Because it's not it's not that there's no process within the agency to help the people who do the reviews incorporate the information. So if it's toxicology, or if it's this, or if it's that, if it's manufacturing process, everybody knows what to look for and how to incorporate. But there is nothing, I believe, that helps the regulators with that translation. And I think it's really challenging, obviously, for the advocates as well. But I wondered if I'd love to hear good ideas on this. But I also
I think that's your new gig. I think that after this, that's your next gig.
Maybe. Well, are there any really great examples that anybody's aware of where a patient group or a company, anybody, has tackled this kind of problem and been successful?
I think it's a great question. But no, it is absolutely a great question. And the first time that I met a patient and was an individual patient, it was extremely powerful in helping. Yet on the other hand, from my perspective at that time, it was also scary because I was not working to get a treatment for one single patient. I was trying to get the treatment approved for all patients. And I think regulators may have that similar first interaction, so helping them in getting there. But one of my pleas would be, look around. If there is a process for 10, 15 years in Europe where patient voices are included in can we learn some of the best practices? What have they learned? How did they help people to get used to it and bring that? I was told it was 1 minute, so unless somebody has a very urgent question, I see that's the last question.
This is just a comment to follow up. I'm wondering if one of the things that patient advocates should try to do is maybe reach out to organizations that professionally look at methodologies for being able to capture patient-reported outcomes, caregiver outcomes, to provide rigor. And I'm thinking of the International Society for Pharmacoeconomic and Outcomes Research, or ISPOR, which looks at outcomes from a methodological approach. And these are people who can potentially be partners to try to develop the tools that would be compelling for regulators and maybe payers.
Thank you. As it is lunchtime and we are now between lunch, so let me thank the panel members very much for their input.
How about a big round of applause for the panel? Thank you, folks.